about why it's important to read research and do research as PWPs. When I think about it, training can't possibly teach us everything in that year. So it's really up to us as clinicians to engage and read research to stay informed. And one example that comes into my mind is cultural adaptations. For example, Mir and colleagues explored the implementation of culturally adapted behavioral activation for Muslim patients. And this is the type of research that we need to engage with and read and understand in order to adapt our existing protocols so that we can better serve our communities. But some questions that I like to ask myself to put research in the front of my mind include, why am I doing what I'm doing with the people who I support? The work, of course, is formulation driven and is co-created, but why do we use a particular approach or technique as PWPs? How do I know what I'm doing is even effective? All these questions boils down to the fact that our work is truly underpinned and driven by psychological research and service-related audits that we do. And this is also what we know as evidence-based practice. For our clinical judgment or our gut and experience working with our service users is also really important because it may actually help us identify gaps in the research knowledge. And this is also what we know as practice-based evidence. And when that happens, we need to do even more research to try and understand, address, or explain those gaps. For example, some questions that you might want to hold in mind is, who is or isn't this therapy working for? Who is or isn't accessing our services? How effective is this therapy for this particular problem? How does this particular adaptation in therapy affect the outcomes for this group of people that we see in our service? So really the bottom line is our research informs our clinical work and our clinical work informs our research. And one diagram that I would really encourage you to hold in mind is the one on the left. And the references below is BPS practice guidelines in 2017. I actually came across this when I was preparing for my clinical training, but I wish I had seen this during my PWP years because I think that is really highly applicable and it's important for us to think about in our clinical work on a day-to-day basis. So it really is my belief that you are all best positioned to do research work, and there's so many reasons for this. You are all skilled in assessing, formulating, and using low intensity techniques day in, day out, and supporting a high volume caseload. And because of this, you have so much experience that you gathered that allows you to be curious and inquisitive about things that might not be working as well in your clinical practice or in your services. And we get told this a lot during our clinical training, but every single time we change placements, supervisors and the team really welcomes us because we are a fresh pair of eyes. It can feel daunting, but it's really, really true because you're coming in as a new person and you can be curious. You want to ask questions. Why do things work like this in this service? And really, PWP are best placed to do research in talking therapy services, especially because of the sheer amount of data that we collect, such as the outcome measures. So the question that you might have right now is, okay, well, is this all even possible? And I want to tell you, yes, it is possible because I've been there myself. And my caseload when I was a qualified pediatrician was extremely high, but I was able to do so. And I really hope that you can feel empowered to do research by the end of this talk. So let's have a think about some tips to get started. And in spirit of being a PWP, let's problem solve in the 6 steps. So step 1, you really want to first identify the problem, and some questions that might help you include, why I'm doing this piece of research, but in what ways will this research be meaningful or helpful? Who is it helpful for? For my clinical work with service users, what went well? What didn't go so well? How can I find out why it went well or why it didn't go so well? And is this a common pattern that's been found between groups of people? If it's a common pattern, then perhaps it suggests that, okay, maybe it is really important for us to look at it to understand this phenomenon. What are the current gaps in the service? Who are we seeing or who are we not seeing? What do service users think? And it's also helpful to think about how can you go about asking service users for their feedback but important that it's not an afterthought. Step 2, generating all possible solutions, also known as how can I go about testing these ideas, the research ideas that I have, or if you're fancy, hypothesis. So would really encourage you to review the literature and think about what is the existing literature already telling us or it's not telling us. If there's a research gap from literature, maybe that is your research question that you can take on board. And how are you going to go about testing these ideas? So this comes into the research method. Are you going to be running an experimental study? Are you going to be looking at existing collected data from your talking therapy services? Or are you going to be creating a survey? Are you going to do an interview? So think carefully about the research methods of how you're going to test these research ideas. And importantly, think about who else do you need to involve. And I'd say think about co-production from the get-go. Is it possible to co-produce the piece of research that you want to do from the beginning? Because it's so important to involve service users. And for example, you might want to ask them to be a part of the research team to help you develop the proposal or develop the research questions, asking them, actually, are these questions interesting for you? Will it be helpful for you to and the community that we serve to understand this a bit better? Step 3 is evaluating your options. The different research methods will take varying amounts of time and resource, so you need to be realistic and only you will know this best according to your own existing caseload. And when thinking about research questions, you also want to think about what are you personally interested in, because this is the main source of motivation to help you see through the piece of research because it has a personal meaning for you. But also you want to think about if you were to use service resources, such as using protected time during your clinical hours to do research, then you may need to consider what would help the service, the communities that you serve, and what the service in itself is interested in. But really, it's important to strike a balance. You might also want to think about what research would help advance the existing LS, low intensity CBT knowledge base. Step 4 is coming up with a plan. So you want to come up with a proposal and propose it to your line manager and supervisor. Think about it as a business case and think of it as a pitch that you want to sell an idea to them. Why is your research important for the service? Why is this important for you and also the field? And can you also negotiate allocated time for this as part of your caseload? Because it's not always possible for people with different commitments to do research outside of their 9 to 5 hours, and this really depends on the individual. So one rationale that you could inform your managers and your supervisor is that it's service development and it's improving the quality of the services and ultimately improving the care that service users receive from the services. Step 5 is putting it into action. All I can say is take that leap of faith and do it. Step 6, evaluating it. So you might want to implement the feedback from your supervisors or line manager. You might also want to think about what else do I need to change about the research questions, or what else do I need to change about the proposal. I also recommend you to create a Gantt chart. It's not necessary, but it gives you a clear timeline of what needs to happen and when does it need to happen by. And it really just helps you feel, holds you accountable when to see this piece of research through. So this sounds a lot like the research cycle, with the only caveat that funding may not always be the norm. So I also want you to hold this in mind when you're coming up with your research ideas and implementing the ideas. Now I just want to spend some time to talk about my own experience of doing research as a qualified PWP. So my research was really informed by my personal experience. I personally IAPT myself in relation to experiences as an LGBTQ plus individual. And when I was accessing therapy, I unfortunately had a really negative experience of the assessment process because the clinician made a lot of assumptions and judgment, which actually left me feel quite invalidated. And after this experience, it made me think a lot about sexual orientation training. So I started thinking about and asking myself, well, what training did I receive myself on my PWP training on sexual orientation issues? And I started to think about, well, what training do other people receive on high intensity courses? Is that enough training? How do we know that this training is sufficient? But I also know from my previous interest in LGBT research that there are differences in outcomes between heterosexual individuals and sexual minority individuals. So from what I was already familiar with and my own personal experience, I started to dig a bit deeper into the literature review. So I was already familiar with the minority stress theory by Meyer in 2003, who suggested that compared to heterosexual individuals, sexual minority individuals are more likely to experience unique stressors that negatively impact their mental health. And in clinical practice, research from IAP studies do show evidence that there are disparities in mental health and treatment outcomes between sexual minority individuals and heterosexual individuals. If you're interested, I would highly recommend you to read the literature by Professor Kate Rimes and colleagues at Talking Therapy Southwark, because I think it's a really good example of doing research in IAPT, and they've also been developing protocols for sexual minority individuals. So I would really recommend you reading this research if you're interested. And I also know from literature that there are different things that may contribute to poor outcomes. And previous research by Stonewall highlighted, for example, fears of and experienced discrimination by healthcare services can act as barriers for people to access help. And Bedell in 2000, in year 2000 in the US, developed a measure to measure competencies of counselors in working with sexual minority individuals. But this helped me identify a research gap. So there were no studies that looked at this in the context of talking therapy services, especially from the perspective of clinicians. And there were no measures of competencies that were specific to this group of clinicians. So how I went about beginning this research. So I built my own research team through making connections with researchers on social media platforms. And I was luckily linked with a university in London. And I connected with a lot of different researchers, such as Alan, who supported me through the whole process and supervised me through the project. But I also think it's really important for me to reflect on my own position. I was in quite a privileged position because I was well connected because of my academic background and also my existing social media platforms. And this was not a funded project, and it involved a lot of hours working outside of my 9 to 5. And like I said previously, I acknowledge that it's not something that's possible for many people due to different range of life reasons. And that's why reflecting on this, I would really encourage you as part of your proposal to see if this research can be incorporated as part of your CPD or part of your job plan as a PWP. So I would really encourage you to discuss this with your supervisors and managers. And at the end of the day, it's also important that they support you from their end to make sure that you can do the research and also develop as a clinician. I also wanted to reflect on whose voices were not heard. If I were to do this piece of research again, I'd probably think even more carefully about co-productions, such as involving service users and asking them about the qualitative questions, what questions they would be interested in asking the clinicians. So I just wanted to talk you through some key findings from my own research. So clinicians found reported a lack of consistency in the minimum training that they receive on sexual orientation issues across both high intensity CBT training and PWP training. And one of the recommendations that we made was to implement minimum training. And there's some research that suggests that at least half day of training on sexual orientation issues can lead to improved competencies working with this client group. Some clinicians also reported that there should be a need for more breadth in the content that they receive. So we recommended that there should be a greater focus in teaching on other sexual identities, such as asexuality or pansexuality. And there should be a focus on psychosocial issues that the sexual minority individuals face, such as chemsex or homelessness. A lot of clinicians also felt that there needs to be more practical adaptations that are taught during our training. And excitingly, Alan and colleagues recently published the LGBTQ plus positive practice guide congratulations. I would really, really encourage all of you to take a read through it. And there's also a pocket guide that you might want to go through, because I think that is just really, really helpful for your clinical practice working with sexual minority individuals. And we also recommended that teaching should incorporate thinking about adaptation from existing theories, such as Meyer et al. In their minority stress theory, and also existing CBT protocols that has been developed to adapt for treatment when working with sexual minority clients. Clinicians also felt that it was important to have more diverse ways of teaching, and as such, we recommended that courses should consider more experiential learning, such as skill-based role plays where people can practice saying things without feeling judged. And another finding that I felt was that really, really struck me was a quote actually from one of the clinicians, that queer people in NHS services have to do extra work and deal with constant microaggressions to push for LGBTQ plus training and development for no extra pay, and it's exhausting. And I think this just really highlights that it's so important to remunerate our staff adequately for the work that they do. CED and I issues, equality and diversity issues, is not just down to people from minoritized backgrounds, it's everyone's business. And if minoritized people do take on these roles, such as champion related roles, then they should be remunerated fairly, and also they should be given protected time to do this work. Otherwise, it's just a source of burden and actually is a microaggression in itself. So finally, the next steps for me is to really try and think about how we can translate the findings from my research to clinical practice. And if there are any stakeholders who are attending this talk today and would like to discuss how we can work together to implement these recommendations, then please do get in touch with me. And if you're interested to read the full paper, the title is Clinician Experiences on Training and Awareness of Sexual Orientation in NHS Talking Therapy Services for Anxiety and Depression. Okay, the final section, I just wanted to talk a bit about writing for journal publication, and I'm going to start with the basics, and these may be things that you already know, but it's best to cover all grounds. And to talk about my own position, at the time I was a first-time author, and I published my work at the BABCP Journal of Cognitive Behavior Therapist. So my tips will be focused on my experience submitting to that particular journal, but I imagine that it will actually be quite transferable regardless of the journal that you are submitting to. So first of all, read the editorial statement because it really tells you the scope of the journal and also the intended audience. As you can see, for the cognitive behavior therapist, it tells you that they usually publish original research or evaluations that's focused on the delivery of CBT, supervision of CBT, training in CBT and service models and delivery of CBT. So it's important when selecting a journal to look at its scope. Otherwise, you might just get an unsuccessful response if it doesn't match the journal's scope. Second of all, I would really encourage you to seriously spend some time to go through the authorship guidelines, because it does save you a lot of the time. It saves you a lot of time later down the line. It's really worth your time to make sure that your manuscript is up to the standard of the journal. But it's also important to know that the editors will also get in touch if there are any issues with the submission. And the key things to be aware of include formatting, so how you reference your work. And for the cognitive behavior therapists especially, they want authors to talk about key learning aims from the paper and also key practice points that readers should take away from reading the paper. So I would really encourage you, before you even start formatting, is just to read through the authorship guidelines. It really does save you a lot of time. And if there's any doubt, ask. So my experience with the cognitive behavior therapist editors were really, really positive. I spoke to Steph and also Richard, who were both incredibly supportive. And I actually just sent them an email. And this is an example of an email that I recently sent in relation to a manuscript I wanted to submit for my Deep Inside project. It's just an example, but you might want to follow this template. but I think that the editors would much rather you ask them if you're not sure. Okay, so Google Scholar can be a really, really important tool because it helps you search for similar articles in your field. And when you've done that, you can have to think about, okay, with these similar articles, what journals did these other people publish their work in? That also gives an insight on ideas of where you can publish your work. And also, you can also consider whether these other researchers and authors of these articles can be suitable reviewers for your manuscript because they're also potentially subject expertise reviewers too. And when selecting reviewers, it might be helpful to ask your supervisors because they might already know colleagues from other universities or from their field who might be experts in the field of your research. And if any doubts, you can also email the journal editors for recommendations. And actually, during the recommendation process, you can also say, I don't know. I don't know any reviewers. I can't recommend any. And the journal editors can help you with that. It's also important to think about whether there are any reviewers that you wouldn't recommend to review your paper and note it down with an explanation. For example, that might be anybody or anyone that may contribute to a biased review, such as, for example, if they were working really closely in your research project, you probably don't want them to be reviewing your work. And it's good to think about both early career and experienced researchers, but also thinking about how realistic it is. For example, Judith Beck may not have the time to read a paper or review your work. So think about a balance of both early career and experienced researchers. And here is a submission flowchart. I'm just going to pause here for a second. And I just really want to thank Steph at the BABCP Journals, who's the managing editor, for providing this submission flowchart. Hopefully the slides will be made available for everybody and I can send it to you all after the conference today. Okay, I'm just going to be moving on because I'm aware of time. So resubmission, and I think this meme, is that what you call it nowadays? Meme, it really captured my feelings. So I did receive I had to resubmit my journal article, and in that moment, I was thinking, gosh, this is too much. But really, everything is fine. It really is fine. I just had to think about actually, it's really good science to be reviewed, to be peer reviewed. And recently, I actually had a manuscript for my declan side that was rejected by a journal, but it's okay. There's so many different reasons why the paper might have been unsuccessful. That could be because it's not meeting the scope of the journal or the readership, but just keep trying because your research is important and it should be disseminated. But yes, it's really normal to receive comments and needing to resubmit the paper. And for the resubmission process, I would recommend you doing a table like this because it makes it very, very clear and it makes it easier for the editors to review the resubmitted piece of work. So the reviewer might go, well, they will go through the whole paper and provide you with feedback or suggestions for changes, but it's not always just negative feedback. It can also be positive feedback. So when you're doing this table, your response might be you want to thank them for providing this feedback. You might want to explain your thoughts and rationale for a particular decision that you made in your research. And you really also want to state the page number on your manuscript and note down the exact changes that you've made to the wording. So you might want to do this as tracked changes on your manuscript when you resubmit your piece of work. A key thing to hold in mind is that you do not always have to agree with the reviewer's response or the comments, sorry, as long as you have a rationale or you're able to justify your response. Be confident in your research because at the end of the day, you've done it yourself and you know your work. Okay, so some key take homes. So I think that PWPs should be encouraged to read research that underpins their evidence-based practice and to take an active role in contributing to research that can further the field. So I would also want you to think about what research are you personally interested in? What gaps have you identified through literature review and your own clinical experience in your service? Come up with a realistic proposal and try to negotiate with your service about having allocated time. However, honestly, this is in bold and red. Managers and supervisors must also provide the necessary support. Actioning those previous points will give you an idea of suitable journals for your paper. Really make sure to read through the manuscript guidelines. Take time to make sure that your paper meets the scope of the journal and format it to reduce the back and forth. Revisions are normal. It's good science to read peer review feedback to improve the quality of your future work. Even if the paper is rejected, that's okay. It means that the journal may not be best suited for your paper. Take some time to review the previous steps, and yes, I wish you all the best. Okay, so this comes to the end of my talk today. Thank you so much for